So my name is Thalansh Batra. I'm the CEO of Pareto Tree. We're building wearable devices to evolve heart failure management. To be very honest with you, our entire company and the entire founding team, we founded the company with a single sole purpose, which was to move our care systems from a reactive to a more predictive and preventive approach. And everything that we do revolves around this one basic theme of moving care systems from reactive to predictive, reactive to predictive. The problem that the problem that we're trying to solve essentially is the lack of tools to detect outpatient heart failure decompensation. In today's world, with all the technology that we have, there's a time delay in hospital presentation from the onset of the earliest symptoms of potential acute decompensated heart failure of 31.9 days. That's almost a month of a delay in hospital representation from a potential from the earliest onset of a potential heart failure decompensation event. Then we definitely know large hospitalizations and huge hospital length of stay for patients as well, and increasing expenditure on heart failure management as well. The solution that we have essentially developed is a wrist wearable device that looks something like this. It allows for remote continuous non-invasive hemodynamic monitoring with over 18 different parameters. It also allows for detecting early signs of heart failure decompensation. It allows for remote monitoring alerts to nurses and clinicians, and it allows for personalization as well. These are the parameters that our wearable device can monitor. And this is really what's unique about us, to be very honest with you. Other than predicting heart failure decompensation, being able to do these parameters on the wrist non-invasively and continuously is an extremely big challenge from a technology standpoint and a clinical standpoint. So our wearable device can essentially monitor arterial blood pressure that's equivalent to an invasive radial arterial line. Then we can also measure cardiac output, cardiac index, stroke volume variability, systemic vascular resistance, arterial stiffness, and your basic heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, and skin temperature. There's a clear financial and clinical validation for remote heart failure monitoring. It looks something like this, right? So existing solutions out there have shown reduced readmission rates by 46%, the cost of reduction of roughly around 100K per 3 months per patient. And there's definitely a case for hospitals for new revenue generation by creating new bed capacity readmissions, by reducing readmissions. Um, Current solutions have also reduced the hospital length of stay by 52% and have reduced mortality by about 10%. The technology that powers our solution is multiple different patents, the first one being our sensor itself, a sensor that allows us to monitor all the parameters that I showed you earlier, and then other various different patents that we have. This is some of our competition. Uh, what's really unique about us is all the parameters and our ability to essentially detect early signs of decompensated heart failure. This is essentially what our business model looks like. So we essentially don't charge for the device at all. We give the device away for free. We charge a $8 per day per patient fee to the clinic or to the hospital for all these different services essentially. And so the medical device with continuous monitoring, patient onboarding and patient education, virtual check-ins, replacements and maintenance, technical support, single-use components, therapeutic analytics engine. These are existing reimbursement codes out there that we can leverage in order to essentially get our solution out there to as many patients as possible. Uh, these are the partnerships that we've had. We've partnered with some great clinical and technology partners like University of California Health System, San Diego Innovation Council, ECTRI is another clinical research institute in San Diego. We're now part of National Science Foundation's ICOR program. We've partnered with ICMR, which is essentially NIH for India, that allows us for huge data collections for our prediction modules and so forth. We've been a part of some great accelerators at the same time, like TechStars, Blackstone and Launchpad, Stardar, Medical Accelerator from IGE, and so forth. We've developed a few prototypes so far, and we plan to launch a pilot by 2022. This is what we're seeking at the moment, which is connections with heart failure specialists and nephrologists. I know it sounds interesting to hear nephrologists here in this presentation. We're actually also looking at the possibility of deploying our solution for chronic kidney disease, considering all the parameters that we're able to do. But any connections to heart failure specialists or nephrologists would be fantastic. I know Gene's here on the call, and I'd love to connect further. Um, Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Thalansh. So this is an opportunity for people to ask questions. Is there anybody who has some preliminary questions about the Pareto Tree technology?
I have a quick question. Thanks for that great presentation. I guess, can you speak a little bit more to the patient experience with your technology?
Sure. Thank you for your comment, by the way. So, quick note: our product is still not out there in the market yet, but the patient experience is actually supposed to be very seamless in the sense of it's a wrist wearable device, right? So it allows for better patient compliance as well. It's just like another wristwatch that goes on the wrist, and you essentially wear it the entire day. I'm not sure if I answered your question well, but I just can't speak enough to it considering our product's still not out there in the market yet.
I think, and I don't want to speak for you, Thalansh, but I think one of the things that I've learned is that his own grandfather had to have similar, some very bulky devices. And so this device is specifically designed to try to be predictive earlier, but also provide information that will get people, both the patient and the medical team monitoring kind of the parameters on an ongoing basis. So I think the patient experience would be a good one, Nikki, because rather than having to stay in the hospital to get those diagnostic checks, the patients could be at their own home. Is that correct, Thalansh?
That's definitely correct, Jacqueline. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can ask a cardiology question. I think, am I the only cardiologist on the phone?
You are the only cardiologist.
Surprise. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Gene Quinn. I'm a cardiologist, and I also do quality patient safety, stuff like that. This is really interesting, and obviously the promise of wearable devices along with big data is exactly what you're talking about, which is predictive rather than reactive types of medicine. Those things, I promise there's a question here, not just me talking. Those types of things obviously take a lot of infrastructure and being able to deal with all of that large data then. I guess my first question, some of the parameters that you're talking about, measuring things like cardiac output, things like arterial stiffness, things like actually even just non-invasive without compression, blood pressure monitoring. Those are relatively difficult things to measure non-invasively, and some of them, especially cardiac output, we tend to measure very invasively if you're going to do it. What kind of studies have you guys done in terms of correlating those with gold standards? That is, the invasive blood pressure or invasive cardiac output?
Gene, that's definitely a wonderful question, and I appreciate you understanding the challenge of it itself, right? So those are definitely very, very difficult parameters to accurately measure non-invasively. So we haven't done many studies just as yet. That will essentially be our next step, which is clinical studies with our clinical partners with gold standards. But essentially, the way we're able to do arterial blood pressure and cardiac output, the way we're able to do arterial blood pressure is actually through machine learning, right? So what we've done is we're able to, so the signal, the sensor that we have is called photoplethysmography, which is something similar to a pulse oximeter, right? So it's essentially the pulse oximeter sensor, and we've made it a little bit more advanced to get a much more clear signal and a much more layered signal. So what we do is essentially from that signal, we correlate every single data point from that signal that we get from a pulse oximeter to that of arterial blood pressure using machine learning. And what we're essentially able to do is we're essentially able to create a similar curve to arterial blood pressure. Let me give me 1 second. I'll just share my screen again. I hope you can see my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we can.
So this is the example of it. This is what I mean. Using machine learning, what we're able to do is we're able to essentially replicate this arterial blood pressure curve, the blue one being the actual arterial blood pressure, and the red one being our estimated non-invasive using PPG, which is photoplethysmography. So we're essentially able to estimate this entire curve using that pulse oximetry signal itself. And we're doing this essentially point by point. So every single data point is predicting the data point of arterial pressure. So that's for arterial pressure. For cardiac output, essentially, we do this using, again, PPG signal itself. And there's a part of the PPG signal that gives us enough information about cardiac output. It's essentially an area under the curve. Sorry, I'm walking you through a lot of these things, but essentially, to answer your question in short, we're now moving towards clinical studies, and that's essentially our next step. But this is how we essentially do all these parameters, and it's definitely an extremely challenging thing to do. We've spent about 2.5 years just developing the sensor behind it and the machine learning models that are accurate enough to be able to get us somewhere with it.
That's really cool, and certainly that that technology, if you can solve the non-invasive way of monitoring some of these things, which has been difficult in the past, it certainly does open up a lot of these types of issues. So that's very interesting.
Thank you so much.
I think the other thing, Dr. Quinn, that I've learned is that they have a patent on their sensor so that some of the false alarms that have happened, it's been my own experience that some of the real downfall with this technology is that there's so many false alarms that both the wearer and the medical team kind of start to ignore it because they don't trust the data anymore. But I think this team is trying to solve for that problem. Do you want to speak to that at all, Thalansh?
Definitely, that's something that we've actually worked very hard towards. So we actually started analyzing the major reasons for false alarms themselves. We said, why are these false alarms happening in the hospital? And why are these false alarms happening in current remote monitoring solutions as well? We realized the major reason for that is motion and movement. As soon as a patient moves their hand or moves any part of the body, false alarms end up going off. So we actually, the sensor that we have that is patented accounts for that movement and allows us to essentially ignore any false alarms and improve our accuracy on alarms as well, quite a bit, roughly by about 40%.
Awesome. So thank you, Thalansh. Jean, you're welcome to ask more questions if you'd like.
Well, thank you. I like to be welcomed. That was just me being funny. My my other question. My other question is too hard. I'll be honest with you. My experience with wearable devices, and we have, just being a clinician, we have lots of patients with wearable devices, and then the question is, what do you do with all of the data that you get? And the more data that you get, we tended to think that the more data that we got, the less people will actually utilize healthcare and the less we'll have to deal with. It's actually the opposite, right? Now, everybody that has an Apple Watch, when it goes strangely or does something, then they go and talk to their doctor about it. So there's actually an increased utilization there. You're right that the decrease in those false alarms can certainly help, but with anything, you're certainly calibrating those false alarms so that you're also not getting false negatives. So my only other, I think the other thing that needs to get solved at the same time is, when you're getting more data, how do you then have a way to deal with that data? And then that's really kind of your implementation part of it. And then, and I expect that with some of these fancy organizations, UCSD, UCSF, UC Davis, that those would probably be a great place to start with some sort of
Oops. We lost you there. I think we lost you there, Jean, for a minute. But I definitely agree. I think I absolutely agree that we sometimes forget that data is just the starting point. Sorry, Jean. I think, Thalansh, do you want to start? Do you want to address that in any way?
Sure. I think that's a very, very genuine point, and a very interesting perspective, and I'm sure that's very, very true. The one thing that we do essentially is, for doctors and for clinicians, we try to take off the burden as much as possible, right? So we don't want this to be another additional task for them. We want this to actually ease off the work that they're doing. And the way we essentially do that is by automating all alerts and detecting any anomalies and any of the signs that we're measuring, by also detecting any pattern type anomalies, right? So once we can detect that, we can alert the clinicians in time, so that they're not having to actually go through tons and tons of data, but instead they're actually just looking at these automated alerts and then reacting based off of them. But data is definitely a huge challenge. With the huge amount of data that you have, what do you do with it is basically the next step. And that prediction that we're working towards, the prediction of heart failure decompensation, is that next logical step with what you do with that data.
Good. And I'm assuming that you're working with a lot of, so Jean, do we have you back? Did you want to finish your question at all?
Sorry, I had my phone propped up on my monitor and it overheated and shut down my phone. Apologies. Technology, I need a solution for that too. No, I think I heard the end of it. It sounded like you got my question, which is just, how do you implement these types of things and then do a study that actually leads to outcomes? And I think it sounds like you've got some great ideas there. So I think that's a great idea.
Good, thank you. Now, I'm going to open it up one more time, and then I have a question if nobody else does. So is there anybody else who would like to ask a question about the Pareto Tree technology?
I actually had one more question.
Sure.
And that is kind of high level. If you can just describe how your machine learning model is set up, and and what kind of data you have and where you get that from?
Sure. So multiple machine learning models, right? So a few machine learning models to just calculate the parameters that we're doing, right? And then other machine learning models to predict heart failure decompensation and so on. So I'll give you a quick background on the heart failure decompensation machine learning model. So one of the major data streams that we have is the wearable device itself, right? And all the 18 different parameters that we're doing. So that's one data stream that we have. The other data stream becomes your EHRs, right? So patient history, patient demographics, and so on and so forth. And both these combined together give us a good amount of information as to what's going on and what's potentially about to happen to that particular patient. But those are essentially the two major inputs, and both those inputs itself turn out to be in essentially hundreds of different features, right? So just one particular, let's say, just age of a patient, right? I can break that down into 6 different features and use that in my machine learning model. So those are essentially the input streams, and then the output essentially being the event itself, predicting the heart failure decompensation event itself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. So we are quickly wrapping up our open innovation today. We typically end right at 1:30, but I'm happy to stay on for a couple more minutes if people want to. The one question I have, Thalansh, is about the remote monitoring for places like Alaska and like India. I mean, we've spoken about this before. I think that, you know, where people are matters because of access to broadband. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you see this, where this technology might be the most appropriate?
The good thing, Jacqueline, that we're actually working towards for environments in places like Alaska and remote parts in India is trying to have um, an, a cellular network built into the device itself. So something like an Apple Watch, the new Apple Watch that has a cellular device, a cellular module built in it. So something similar that we're trying to have built in our device itself as well. And that's definitely the goal, being, trying to make it as accessible as possible, rather than having to be reliant on Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or anything else. So the device becomes self-reliant itself, and then can connect through to essentially the internet, and even provide all the data to the cloud. At the same time, can ping for any emergencies that a patient might have using the cellular network.
Thank you very much. Thank you for thinking that through, because I think sometimes all of this technology is very exciting, and then at certain ranges in Alaska, people just simply can't use them. So I'm really happy that you thought that through. Well, I'd like to say thank you, Thalansh, for presenting today. I'm really excited about what you're developing. I would like to stay in touch. This would be something that after you've done your pilot studies, I'd like to learn more, and perhaps that would be an appropriate time also to kind of update Dr. Quinn about where what additional clinical studies that you've done. So thank you everyone for coming today. It was wonderful to see you all and to have Thalansh here, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. Yes, if everyone could give Thalansh a round of applause, I'd appreciate that. And we really appreciate your time, Thalansh.
Thank you so much, everyone. I genuinely appreciate you taking out the time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care. Bye now.